Welcome, dear listener, to the Silent Archives, where ancient puzzles rest quietly in museum cases, waiting to share their silent mysteries with those patient enough to listen. Tonight, we journey together not to battlefields or beaches, but to a Mediterranean island where the earth once held secrets pressed into clay, where symbols spiral inward toward a center that no one can read. As you settle into comfort, allowing the cares of your day to gradually release their hold, know that you are safe here. In this space we share. The story I'm about to tell you is one of genuine archaeological mystery, a puzzle that has captivated scholars, linguists, and dreamers for over a century. Yet in its telling, there is a strange peace, a reminder that some questions whisper rather than shout, and that sometimes the most profound mysteries are those small enough to hold in your hands. Take a gentle breath with me now. Feel yourself becoming more comfortable with each passing moment. The world outside can wait. Here, in these archives of sleeping stories, time moves differently. We can traverse millennia in a heartbeat, stand beside archaeologists as they brush away ancient dust, hold in our minds an object that has refused to yield its secrets for 4,000 years. Before we begin our journey to the island of Crete, to a palace buried beneath centuries of silence, let's take a few moments to prepare ourselves for the story ahead. Close your eyes if you haven't already, and imagine yourself standing in a quiet museum gallery. The year doesn't matter just yet. Time itself seems to pause here, waiting patiently for you to be ready. Feel the cool floor beneath your feet, polished smooth by thousands of visitors who have come before you. The air is still and slightly cool. The kind of controlled environment museums maintain to preserve their treasures. Soft lighting illuminates the display cases, each one a small window into the past. Each artifact a story waiting to be understood, or perhaps a story that will forever remain just beyond understanding. Before you, in a glass case, sits a disc of fired clay, no larger than a dinner plate. Its surface is covered with symbols arranged in a spiral, each sign pressed carefully into the soft clay before it was baked hard, each mark a mystery that has outlasted the civilization that created it. The disc has a warm color, a reddish-brown that speaks of Mediterranean earth and ancient kilns. The symbols are clear despite their age, their impressions deep and precise, testimony to the care with which they were made. Around you, other visitors move quietly through the gallery. Some pause briefly before the disc, snap a photograph, and move on. Others stand for long minutes, leaning close to the glass, trying to decipher what cannot be deciphered, trying to see patterns where none have been confirmed. And the disc accepts all this attention equally, giving nothing away, keeping its secrets as it has kept them for 40 centuries. Breathe in slowly, matching your breath to the patient rhythm of museums, where artifacts wait years between visitors who truly see them. In through your nose, feeling the cool air fill your lungs. Hold for just a moment at the top of your breath, then release gently through your mouth. Like the spiral on the disc itself, your breathing finds its natural pace, circling inward toward rest, in and out, constant and calm. The object we're exploring tonight is called the Phaistos Disc, named for the place where it was discovered. But before we arrive at that moment of discovery, that summer day in 1908, when the Earth finally released what it had held for so long, let yourself simply be present with the timeless quality of mystery itself, of questions that wait patiently for answers that may never come. Picture a spiral, that ancient symbol found in cultures around the world. It appears in Celtic art and Aboriginal paintings, in shells and galaxies, in the unfurling of ferns and the arrangement of seeds in a sunflower. It's a shape that seems to move while staying still, that draws the eye inward or outward depending on where you begin. It's a boundary that is also a path, a line that both divides and connects. Much like the mystery we're about to explore, some things are meant to be contemplated rather than solved. followed rather than grasped. Your body continues to relax, growing heavier and more comfortable with each breath. Any remaining tension in your shoulders melts away like wax softening in afternoon Sunday. Your jaw unclenches, your forehead smooths. Your hands rest gently, no longer grasping or holding, simply being. You are becoming part of the patient rhythm of archaeological time, where centuries pass between one moment and the next, where objects wait in darkness until someone brings them back into light. Now, as we prepare to step into our story, remember that you can drift away at any time. The narrative will continue, my voice a gentle current that can carry you into sleep whenever you're ready. There's no need to remember every detail, no test at the end, no obligation to stay alert. Simply let the story wash over you, like waves lapping at Mediterranean shores, taking from it whatever feels right for you tonight. Let the words become a soft background, a gentle companion, into rest. Our story begins on a small island in the Mediterranean Sea, a place where Europe meets Africa and Asia, where civilizations have risen and fallen for tens of thousands of years. The island is Crete, and in ancient times, it was home to one of the most sophisticated and mysterious cultures of the Bronze Age, the Minoans. Crete itself is a landscape of contrasts. Mountains rise steeply from the coast, their peaks sometimes capped with snow even in summer. Between the mountains lie fertile plains, where olive groves and vineyards have flourished since ancient times. The coast is indented with harbors and bays, natural ports that made Crete a crossroads of Mediterranean trade. The light has a particular quality, clear and golden, the kind of light that makes distant objects seem closer, that sharpens the edges of things. The Minoans, named much later by archaeologists after the legendary king Minos, flourished on Crete from approximately 3,000 years before the Common Era until around 1,100 years before the Common Era. They built magnificent palaces, created stunning frescoes that still captivate viewers with their grace and movement, developed extensive trade networks that reached across the Mediterranean and perhaps beyond, and left behind two writing systems that scholars call Linear A and Linear B. Linear B was eventually deciphered in 1952 by a young English architect named Michael Ventris, who had been fascinated by the script since seeing photographs of Linear B tablets as a schoolboy. His breakthrough revealed it to be an early form of Greek, used by the Mycenaean civilization that eventually came to dominate Crete after the Minoan decline. The decipherment was a triumph of linguistic analysis and intuition, proof that ancient scripts could yield their secrets to patient study and clever thinking. But Linear A, the older script, remains mysterious even today, its language still unknown despite decades of scholarly effort. We can read the symbols, in the sense that we know what sounds they likely represented based on their relationship to Linear B. But we cannot understand the language they encode. It appears not to be Greek, nor any other known Indo-European language. It remains silent, tantalizingly close to comprehension, yet ultimately unreadable. The Minoans, it seems, had a gift for creating mysteries that would outlast their civilization. Their palaces, with their labyrinthine layouts, inspired the Greek myth of the Minotaur and the maze built by Daedalus. Their art depicts religious ceremonies we cannot fully interpret, shows deities whose names and attributes are largely unknown to us. Even their sudden decline around 1,500 years before the Common Era remains a subject of scholarly debate. Was it the volcanic eruption of Thera? Invasion by Mycenaeans? Economic collapse? Climate change? Internal strife? We have theories but no certainty. But our story focuses on something even more enigmatic than Linear A, something that stands alone in the archaeological record, with no clear precedent and no obvious descendants. It is an object that raises more questions than it answers, that has inspired hundreds of attempted translations and countless theories, yet remains as mysterious today as it was on the day of its discovery. The story of the Phaistos Disc begins, as so many archaeological stories do, with excavation. In the early years of the 20th century, archaeology was still a relatively young science, and the Mediterranean was alive with discoveries. The ruins of Troy had been excavated by Heinrich Schliemann, though his methods were crude by modern standards. The palaces of Mycenae had been explored, revealing the wealth and power of Bronze Age Greece. And attention had turned to Crete, where legends spoke of a great king and a labyrinth housing a monster half man, half bull. Arthur Evans, a British archaeologist, had begun his famous excavations at Knossos in 1900, uncovering what he called the Palace of Minos. His work there would continue for decades, revealing a complex of buildings that covered several acres, with sophisticated architecture, elaborate frescoes, and evidence of a civilization that had been powerful and prosperous. Evans's work at Knossos, though controversial in some of its reconstructions and interpretations, opened European eyes to the sophistication of Bronze Age Aegean civilization. Italian archaeologists had also begun work at various sites on Crete, drawn by the promise of uncovering the truth behind the myths, of finding material evidence for the stories that had been passed down through Greek literature and legend. One of these sites was Phaistos, located on a hill overlooking the Massara plain in southern Crete. The site had been known to archaeologists for some time, and initial soundings had revealed promising remains. Here stood the ruins of a Minoan palace, second in size only to the famous palace at Knossos in the north of the island. The location was magnificent, commanding views across the plain to the mountains beyond, with easy access to the southern coast and its harbors. It was the kind of site that spoke of power and prosperity, of a center of administration and perhaps religious authority. The palace at Phaistos was a complex structure, built and rebuilt over centuries. Archaeological investigation would eventually reveal multiple building phases, with the earliest remains dating back to around 2,000 years before the Common Era. The palace had courtyards and storage rooms, workshops and ceremonial spaces, a sophisticated drainage system and architectural features that spoke to advanced engineering knowledge. Like other Minoan palaces, it featured the characteristic ashlar masonry, the carefully cut and fitted stone blocks that created smooth walls and impressive facades. The palace's plan was complex, with rooms opening off one another in patterns that seem labyrinthine to modern eyes. Storage magazines held enormous clay pithoi, storage jars that could hold olive oil, wine, grain, and other commodities. Workshops contained tools and evidence of craft production. Living quarters featured sophisticated amenities. The palace was not just a royal residence but an economic and administrative center, a hub of activity and authority. Like other Minoan palaces, it had been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times, perhaps by earthquakes, perhaps by fire, perhaps by human conflict. Crete sits in a seismically active region, and earthquakes were a recurring threat to Bronze Age settlements. Evidence of destruction by fire appears in many layers of Minoan sites, though whether these fires were accidental or deliberate, the result of earthquake damage or warfare, remains debated. The final destruction came sometime around 1500 years before the Common Era, after which the palace was never fully rebuilt, though the site continued to be occupied at a reduced scale. On the 3rd of July, 1908, an Italian archaeologist named Luigi Pernier was excavating in one of the palace's basement rooms. Pernier was an experienced archaeologist, trained in the methods of his time, careful in his documentation, and systematic in his approach. He was working in the north wing of the palace, in rooms that appeared to have been used for storage or perhaps archive purposes, part of the palace's administrative quarters. The excavation season was underway, with workers clearing debris under the supervision of the archaeological team. The work was slow and painstaking, as all careful archaeological work must be. Each layer of earth was examined, each object documented in notebooks and on plans. Each find placed carefully in context, so its relationship to other materials could be understood. The stratigraphy, the layering of deposits over time, told a story that had to be read carefully to be understood properly. The room Pernier was excavating that day was filled with what archaeologists call a destruction layer: deposits of ash and broken pottery, collapsed roof materials and other debris that marked the violent end of the palace. Within such layers, objects were often found as they had been at the moment of disaster, caught in time, frozen in their final positions. It was poignant work, sifting through the remains of catastrophe, handling objects last touched by people fleeing or dying, recovering the fragments of lives lived 4,000 years in the past. The day was hot, as summer days in Crete tend to be. The sun beat down on the excavation, and the work raised dust that coated everything and everyone. Water had to be carried to the site. The workers, local men hired for the season, moved earth in baskets, carefully when directed to do so by the archaeologists, more quickly when clearing obviously disturbed or recent deposits. It was demanding work, both physically and mentally, requiring constant attention and decision-making. But then, among the rubble and ash that marked the palace's destruction, Pernier's tools revealed something extraordinary. It was a disc of fired clay, roughly 16 centimeters in diameter, about the size of a modern dinner plate, though thicker and heavier, about 2 centimeters thick at its thickest point, and weighing approximately 200 grams. Both sides of the disc were covered with symbols arranged in a spiral pattern, running from the outer edge toward the center. Imagine that moment of discovery. The brush revealing the disc's surface for the first time in millennia. The symbols emerging from centuries of darkness into Mediterranean sunlight. Pernier would have recognized immediately that this was something unusual, something that did not fit the usual categories of Minoan artifacts. The symbols were unlike anything found elsewhere in Minoan archaeology. They weren't linear A or linear B, the two scripts known from Minoan and Mycenaean contexts. They weren't hieroglyphic or pictographic in any familiar way. They were something else entirely, something unique. The disc's condition was remarkable. Despite being buried beneath the rubble of a destroyed building, despite 40 centuries in the earth, it was nearly intact, with only minor chips and abrasions. The symbols were clear and legible, their impressions deep enough that even dirt and time had not obscured them. This was partly due to the firing process, which had hardened the clay to a durable ceramic, and partly to the fortunate circumstances of its burial, which had protected it from crushing or erosion. The disc had been made with considerable care and skill. The clay had been prepared, probably by levigating, a process of mixing clay with water and allowing heavier particles to settle out, leaving a fine, workable clay body. This prepared clay was then formed into a circular shape, possibly on a potter's wheel, though the disc could also have been shaped by hand on a flat surface. The edges were smoothed and the surfaces made flat and even. Then, while the clay was still leather-hard, in that perfect state between wet and dry when clay can be carved or impressed without distorting, someone had carefully pressed symbols into the clay's surface using individual stamps or punches, working from the outside edge in a spiral toward the center. They had created a text of some kind, or perhaps something that looked like a text, or something that served a purpose we can no longer imagine. Each symbol was pressed firmly enough to leave a clear impression, but gently enough not to distort the clay or create cracks. This required considerable skill, a practiced hand that knew exactly how much pressure to apply, at what angle, with what rhythm. The work was systematic, moving steadily from edge to center, following the spiral path, maintaining consistent spacing and alignment. After all the symbols were in place, the disc was allowed to dry completely, then fired in a kiln, hardening it permanently into the form we see today. This method of creating text was itself unusual and significant. In the ancient world, writing was typically scratched or painted onto surfaces, not stamped. Clay tablets were usually inscribed with a stylus while the clay was soft. Stone inscriptions were carved with chisels. Papyrus and parchment were written on with ink. But stamping, using prefabricated stamps to impress symbols into a soft medium, was rare. The use of movable stamps suggested a sophisticated approach to creating text, a kind of ancient printing technology that anticipated later developments by millennia. It meant that someone had created a set of at least 45 individual stamps, one for each unique symbol, and had the skill to use them precisely and consistently. This represented a significant investment of time and effort, suggesting that the stamping system was intended for more than just creating a single document. Yet, as we shall see, no other examples of this stamping system have ever been found. The Phaistos Disc stands alone, apparently unique, the only surviving example of whatever tradition or technology it represents. This uniqueness is part of what makes it so frustrating to scholars and so captivating to everyone else. It's a text without context, a writing system without corpus, a voice speaking in a language no one else remembers. The symbols themselves were clearly representational. Unlike abstract marks or purely geometric signs, they depicted recognizable objects and figures from the ancient world. There was a human head with a distinctive plumed headdress, perhaps indicating a person of rank or a particular ethnic group, or simply a decorative element. There was a walking man, shown in profile in the characteristic style of ancient art. There was a running man, legs bent to show motion. There was a woman, possibly identified by clothing or hairstyle. There was a child, smaller and simpler in form. There were objects, a ship with a high prow and stern, the kind of vessel that sailed the Bronze Age Mediterranean. A shield, perhaps a figure-eight shield of the type depicted in Minoan art. A bow, the weapon of hunters and warriors. There were animals, a fish, a bird, what appeared to be a bee or wasp, perhaps a dolphin, possibly a dove. There were plants, a flower with multiple petals, a tree or branch, possibly grain stalks or reeds. There were architectural elements, what appeared to be a pillar or column, perhaps a building facade, possibly a shrine or altar. There were tools and implements, something that might be a saw or comb, what could be an axe or hammer, possibly a leatherworking tool. There were abstract symbols as well, dots and lines, geometric patterns, shapes that didn't clearly represent any specific object. Some symbols appeared multiple times throughout the text. Others occurred only once or twice. In total, there were 241 individual symbol impressions on the disc, divided into groups by vertical lines that presumably represented word divisions or some similar organizational principle. The groups varied in length from 2 to 7 symbols, averaging about 4 symbols per group. This organization suggested a structured text, carefully composed according to some system or convention. Pernier carefully removed the disc from its resting place and documented its context with the thoroughness that characterized good archaeological practice. It had been found in a basement room in the north wing of the palace, in a layer containing debris from the palace's final destruction. Along with the disc were found other artifacts, fragments of pottery, pieces of linear, tablets, small finds like beads and seal stones, all the mixed debris typical of a destruction layer. The presence of linear A tablets in the same context was significant, though not ultimately helpful for decipherment. It established that the disc dated from the later palace period, when linear A was in use. But the two scripts were clearly different, and knowing linear A, or rather not knowing it, since it remains undeciphered, didn't help with reading the disc. If anything, the coexistence of two different writing systems in the same context deepened the mystery. Pernier's publication of the disc was prompt and careful. By 1909, he had produced a detailed article describing the find, its context, and the symbols it bore. He provided drawings of the symbols and photographs of the disc itself. He noted its unusual characteristics and speculated cautiously about its possible meaning. He recognized it as something extraordinary, though he could not have imagined how long it would remain mysterious. The disc was transported to the archaeological museum in Heraklion, Crete's capital, where it remains to this day. It sits in a climate-controlled case, under careful lighting that doesn't fade or damage the fired clay, but allows visitors to see the symbols clearly. The case is positioned so that visitors can view both sides of the disc, can see the spiral of symbols running from edge to center on both faces. One of the museum's most famous and mysterious objects, it draws visitors from around the world. People who stand before it with expressions of fascination, puzzlement, wonder. The museum label provides basic information: date of discovery, location, probable date of creation, physical description, but it cannot provide the one piece of information everyone wants. What does it say? That question remains unanswered. A gap in the label, a silence in the museum's narrative, a mystery that the museum must acknowledge but cannot resolve. From the moment of its discovery, the Phaistos Disc captured scholarly imagination. Here was a text in an unknown script, from an ancient civilization, found in a controlled archaeological context. It was the kind of puzzle that scholars dream about, a genuine mystery waiting to be solved. The symbols were clear and well preserved. The object was complete and undamaged. Surely, with enough study, with enough comparative analysis, with enough clever thinking, someone would crack the code. But more than a century has passed since that July day in 1908, and the Phaistos Disc remains undeciphered. Despite countless attempts, despite hundreds of proposed solutions, despite the application of modern computational and linguistic methods, we still cannot read what the disc says. We don't know what language it represents, what its purpose was, or even whether it's truly writing in the conventional sense. This failure to decipher the disc is not for lack of trying. Scholars from around the world have devoted careers to studying it. Linguists with expertise in ancient Mediterranean languages, archaeologists familiar with Minoan culture, cryptographers experienced in code breaking, computer scientists with powerful analytical tools, and amateur enthusiasts with fresh perspectives have all taken their turn at attempting to unlock its secrets. Theories have multiplied over the decades, each offering a different interpretation of what the symbols mean and what the disc represents. Some of these theories are careful and scholarly, based on comparative analysis with other ancient scripts and linguistic systems, drawing on deep knowledge of Bronze Age Aegean culture and careful statistical analysis of the symbol's distribution and frequency. Others are more speculative, sometimes veering into territory that most academics would consider pseudoscience, proposing connections to lost continents, or extraterrestrial visitors, or secret wisdom traditions. The disc has become something of a Rorschach test, onto which people project their own ideas about ancient civilizations, lost knowledge, and hidden meanings. Let us consider first the basic questions that anyone attempting to decipher the disc must answer. What is it? A text in an unknown language. A musical notation system for recording melodies or rhythms. A game board with symbols indicating moves or positions. A prayer or religious incantation meant to be recited in ritual. A list of offerings or inventory of goods. A calendar or astronomical document recording celestial observations. Each of these possibilities has been proposed at various times, and each has its advocates who point to specific features of the disc that support their interpretation. If the disc is a text, what kind of writing system does it use? Is it alphabetic, with each symbol representing a single sound, a consonant or vowel? Is it syllabic, with symbols representing combinations of consonants and vowels, like Japanese kana or Cherokee syllabary? Is it logographic, with symbols representing entire words or concepts, like Chinese characters or Egyptian hieroglyphics? Or is it some combination, mixing phonetic and semantic elements? The relatively small number of unique symbols, 45 in total, provides some clues. This number is too small for a purely logographic system, which would need hundreds or thousands of symbols to represent all the words in a language. It's also somewhat small for an alphabetic system representing a language with many consonants and vowels, though not impossibly so. It's well suited to a syllabic system, which typically employs between 50 and 100 symbols. This has led many scholars to suspect that the disc uses syllabic writing, if it's writing at all. Then there's the question of language. What language did the Minoans speak? This is still hotly debated among scholars. Linear B, we know from Michael Ventras's decipherment, represents an early form of Greek, specifically a dialect scholars call Mycenaean Greek. But Linear A, the older script used by the Minoans before the Mycenaean conquest or cultural takeover, clearly represents a different language, one that appears not to be Indo-European at all, based on its grammatical structure and vocabulary patterns. Could the Phaistos Disc represent yet another language? Or could it be an earlier form of the language written in Linear A? Or perhaps a completely different linguistic tradition altogether, brought to Crete from somewhere else? Without being able to compare the disc's script with any other known text, without any bilingual inscriptions or external references, without even being certain that it is a linguistic text, these questions remain unanswerable. And what do the symbols represent? If they're phonetic, representing sounds, what sounds do they make? If they're semantic, representing meanings directly, what meanings do they convey? Are they a mix of both, like Egyptian hieroglyphics, which could be read either phonetically or logographically depending on context? Without being able to compare the disc's script with any other known text, without knowing the language, without any key or parallel text, we cannot determine what the symbols mean. The direction of reading presents another puzzle. Does the spiral run from outside to inside, or inside to outside? Most scholars assume it runs from the outer edge, inward, toward the center, because that's the more natural way to spiral text on a circular surface. And because tiny scratched lines on the disc suggest boxes were drawn first, and then filled with symbols, starting from the outside. But this is informed assumption, not certain knowledge. Some have suggested it might be read in both directions, with the two sides meant to be read alternately, weaving back and forth between them in some complex pattern. One of the most frustrating aspects of attempting to decipher the Phaistos Disc is its uniqueness. In cryptography and linguistics, having multiple examples of a text is enormously helpful for identifying patterns, analyzing frequencies, recognizing common words or phrases. When Thomas Young and Jean-François Champollion worked on deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphics, they had the Rosetta Stone with its parallel texts in hieroglyphic, demotic, and Greek. When Michael Ventras deciphered Linear B, he had hundreds of tablets to work with, allowing statistical analysis and pattern recognition. But the Phaistos Disc stands alone. No other examples of this stamping system have ever been found, despite more than a century of archaeological work on Crete and throughout the Mediterranean. Excavations have continued at Phaistos and at dozens of other Minoan and Bronze Age sites. Thousands of artifacts have been recovered, but nothing else like the Phaistos Disc has ever appeared. This uniqueness has led some scholars to question the disc's authenticity. Could it be a forgery, created in the early 20th century and planted at the excavation site? This theory, while controversial and not widely accepted, has been seriously discussed in academic circles. The timing of the discovery, coming during an era when archaeological forgeries were not uncommon, and the disc's convenient similarity to modern notions of what ancient writing should look like, have raised suspicions in some quarters. Proponents of the forgery theory point to several factors. The disc was found during the early days of Minoan archaeology, when methods were less rigorous than they later became. Its discoverer, Pernier, published it quickly but provided limited, detailed documentation of the exact circumstances of discovery. The writing system is unlike anything else found in the Bronze Age Aegean, which could suggest it's a forger's fantasy rather than genuine, ancient writing. And the disc's physical characteristics, while consistent with ancient pottery, could potentially have been faked by someone with knowledge of ceramic techniques. However, most scholars accept the disc as genuine for several compelling reasons. The archaeological context of its discovery was well documented by the standards of early 20th century archaeology. Luigi Pernier was a respected archaeologist who maintained detailed records of his excavations at Phaistos. The disc was found alongside other artifacts, including linear A, tablets, and pottery fragments, all of which were consistent with the destruction layer in which they were found. Chemical and stylistic analysis of the clay has found it consistent with other Minoan ceramics from the same period and region. The firing temperature, clay composition, and manufacturing techniques all match what we know of Bronze Age pottery production. While these features could theoretically be faked, it would require considerable knowledge and skill that would have been rare in 1908. Moreover, while the disc is unique, the Minoans did produce other unusual objects. They created sophisticated seals with detailed miniature scenes. They developed at least two writing systems, linear A and B, as well as a hieroglyphic script. They traded extensively and had contact with multiple cultures, which could explain foreign influences. Uniqueness alone doesn't prove forgery, especially in an archaeological record that's inherently fragmentary. The forgery theory also struggles to explain the motivation. If someone went to the trouble of creating an elaborate fake disc, why make it undecipherable? Forgers usually create objects that fit expectations or reveal desired information. An undecipherable disc that raises more questions than it answers seems an odd choice for a faker. And if Pernier himself was the forger, why create something that would frustrate scholars indefinitely rather than something that would enhance his reputation by providing new historical information? So we proceed assuming the disc is genuine, which leaves us with the puzzle of why it's unique. Why would the Minoans, or whoever created the disc, develop this stamped writing system, create at least 45 individual stamps, carefully compose this spiral text, fire the disc to preserve it permanently, and then never use the system again? Or if they did use it again, why have no other examples survived? One possibility is that the disc wasn't created on Crete at all. Perhaps it was imported from somewhere else. A foreign object that ended up in the palace at Phaistos through trade or diplomacy or conquest, or even as a curiosity. This would explain why its writing system differs from linear A and B, and why no other examples have been found on Crete. The disc could represent a writing tradition from another culture, preserved at Phaistos but originating elsewhere. But if it came from elsewhere, where? And why haven't examples been found in that original location? Some scholars have suggested connections to Anatolia, the region comprising modern Turkey. Certain symbols on the disc bear some resemblance to signs found in Luwian hieroglyphics and other Anatolian scripts. The stamping technique has parallels in Anatolian seal impressions. But these similarities are suggestive, rather than conclusive, and no clear connection has been established. Others have proposed links to other regions: the Aegean Islands, mainland Greece, Egypt, the Levant, Cyprus, even more distant locations like the Indus Valley or the Western Mediterranean. Each theory offers intriguing parallels, but none provides definitive proof. The disc remains stubbornly resistant to easy categorization, refusing to fit neatly into any known cultural or linguistic context. The content of the text, whatever it might be, remains pure speculation. Without understanding the language or the writing system, we cannot know what the disc says. It might be something mundane, a list of offerings or supplies, a record of tribute or taxation, an inventory of palace goods. Administrative documents were common in Bronze Age palaces. which maintained sophisticated economic systems requiring careful record-keeping. It might be literary, a poem or prayer or myth, something meant to be recited or sung rather than merely read silently. The spiral format could suggest a ceremonial use, with the text meant to be read in a ritual context, spiraling inward toward a climactic center. The repetition of certain symbols has led some scholars to suggest the disc might be a hymn or prayer, with repeated refrains or invocations to deities. It might be legal or diplomatic, a contract or treaty or law code, something recording agreements or obligations. Such documents were important in the Bronze Age world, where complex relationships between kingdoms and city-states required formal documentation. The careful manufacture and firing of the disc could indicate something meant to be permanent and authoritative. It might be magical or religious, an incantation or spell designed to invoke divine powers, a talisman or amulet meant to protect or bless. Ancient Mediterranean cultures had rich traditions of magical texts, and the unusual format and unique writing system could suggest something outside ordinary communication, something meant for interaction with the divine rather than with human readers. Or it might be something entirely different, something that doesn't fit modern categories, serving a purpose we can no longer imagine. Ancient cultures operated with different assumptions and priorities than modern ones, and objects that seem mysterious to us might have had perfectly mundane or obvious purposes in their original contexts. The symbols' arrangement provides some clues to structure and organization. They're divided into groups separated by vertical lines, creating what appear to be 61 word groups on side A and 30 on side B. These groups vary in length from 2 to 7 symbols, suggesting some kind of linguistic structure where words or meaningful units have variable length. This is consistent with natural language, where words range from short to long. But it's also consistent with other systems like musical notation or mathematical expressions. Computer analysis has been applied to the disc in recent decades, looking for patterns in symbol frequency and distribution. These studies have revealed some interesting features. Certain symbols tend to appear together, suggesting they might form common words or phrases or meaningful combinations. The distribution of symbols across the two sides of the disc is not random, suggesting purposeful composition rather than arbitrary decoration. Some symbols appear primarily at the beginning or end of groups, suggesting they might serve grammatical functions. Statistical analysis has examined the frequency distribution of symbols, looking for patterns that might indicate linguistic text. Natural languages show characteristic patterns in how frequently different sounds or words appear. Common words like articles and prepositions appear very frequently, while content words appear less often. The disc's symbol frequencies show patterns that are consistent with linguistic text, though not conclusively so. Entropy analysis, which measures the information content and predictability of sequences, has also been applied. This kind of analysis can sometimes distinguish between meaningful text and random sequences, between structured information and decorative patterns. Results have generally supported the idea that the disc represents a linguistic text of some kind, rather than a game board or purely decorative object. But they cannot tell us what language or what the text says. The symbols themselves have been catalogued and numbered by scholars, given designations based on what they appear to depict. These labels are purely descriptive, based on what the symbols look like, and should not be taken as indications of what the symbols mean or represent. A symbol that looks like a shield might represent the sound she, or the word protection, or a personal name or a military title or something else entirely. We simply don't know. Some symbols are quite clear and easy to identify. The human figures, with their distinctive postures and details, are recognizable as people. The ship, with its high prow and stern, is clearly a vessel. The various animals, though stylized, are identifiable as fish, birds, possibly bees or wasps. These representational symbols have a visual clarity that makes them accessible to modern viewers. even if their meaning remains mysterious. But others are more ambiguous. What looks like a comb might be a musical instrument, like a lyre or a tool for textile production, or an architectural element, or something else entirely. What appears to be a beehive or thatched building might be a storage vessel, or a shield, or a representation of something we can't identify. What seems to be a plant or tree might be a ceremonial object or a symbol representing an abstract concept. Ancient representations often employed conventions that are not immediately obvious to modern viewers. Symbolic languages we no longer speak. The craftsmanship of the disc itself speaks to the importance of its contents, whatever they might be. Creating the individual stamps would have required considerable skill and time. Each one had to be carefully carved, probably from wood or bone or possibly metal, with enough precision to create clear impressions in clay. The stamps had to be mirror images of the final symbols, requiring the craftsperson to think in reverse. To carve what would appear correct only when impressed. This kind of work demands spatial reasoning and manual dexterity, the skills of a trained artisan. The stamps also had to be durable enough to be used multiple times without wearing down or breaking. Wood might work for a single disc, but would eventually wear smooth. Bone or ivory would be more durable. Metal, if the technology was available, would be most durable of all. We don't know what material was used because the stamps themselves have never been found, but their existence is proven by the disc's very creation. This investment in creating stamps suggests a level of commitment to the writing system that seems inconsistent with creating only a single document. Why go to the trouble of making 45 different stamps, each one requiring hours of careful work, if you only plan to use them once? It would be like inventing movable type for printing and then printing only a single page. The effort doesn't match the output, which deepens the mystery of why no other examples have been found. Yet that appears to be what happened. Unless other examples remain undiscovered, buried in sites not yet excavated or destroyed by the passage of time, unless they exist in private collections unrecognized for what they are, unless they were made of materials less durable than fired clay and have disintegrated, the Phaistos Disc stands alone. It is a writing system with a single surviving document, a technology used once or rarely, a voice speaking a language we cannot hear. There is something profoundly moving about this silence. This inability to hear what someone from 4,000 years ago was trying to communicate. They pressed these symbols into clay with care and intention. Each mark was deliberate, each symbol chosen for its meaning, each group arranged according to rules or conventions that made sense to the creator. The person who made the disc, whose hands shaped the clay and pressed the stamps, had something to say, something important enough to record permanently, to fire in a kiln so it would last. And it has lasted, surviving earthquakes and fires, conquest and time, the destruction of the palace and the collapse of the civilization. Yet we cannot read it. The message endures, but its meaning is lost. Think about what this means. Somewhere in the ruins of the palace at Phaistos, or in another building nearby, or in some workshop in a town we haven't excavated, there might have been other discs. There might have been a whole archive of them, carefully stored, part of a larger system of record-keeping or communication or ritual practice. But if they existed, they're gone now. Perhaps they were destroyed in the same catastrophe that destroyed the palace. Perhaps they were cleared away as rubble. Perhaps they were broken and discarded as worthless pottery shards, their significance unrecognized. Or perhaps the Phaistos disc really was unique even in its own time. Perhaps it was a special object, created for a specific purpose, never meant to be part of a series. Perhaps it was a gift from a foreign dignitary, created in a distant land and brought to Crete as a diplomatic offering or trade good. Perhaps it was a one-time experiment in a new writing technology that was never adopted more widely. Perhaps it was the work of a single individual, someone literate in a foreign script, who created this disc for their own purposes and whose knowledge died with them. As you continue to relax, letting sleep approach at its own gentle pace, consider the nature of communication itself across time. We spend our lives trying to convey meaning to others, trying to be understood. We choose our words carefully, craft our messages with intention, hope that what we say will be received as we intend. Yet misunderstanding is common even in shared languages, even in face-to-face conversation. How much more profound is the silence between the creator of the Phaistos Disc and us, separated not just by language but by culture, by worldview, by 4,000 years of human history. The disc sits in its museum case now, a beautiful object, even if we cannot read it. The spiral of symbols draws the eye inward, creating a visual rhythm that is pleasing regardless of meaning. The clay has a warm color, a reddish-brown, typical of Cretan ceramics, earthy and organic. The impressions of the symbols are clear and deep, testimony to the care with which they were made. Under the museum's lighting, the symbols cast tiny shadows, giving them depth and dimension, making them seem almost alive. The disc has weight in the hand, substance, permanence. Museum curators who have handled it speak of this tangible connection to the past. The knowledge that they're holding something created and touched by hands 4,000 years ago. It has survived so much, this small object. And in surviving, it has become a kind of monument to the limits of our understanding, a reminder that the past speaks to us, but we don't always comprehend the language. Over the decades since its discovery, the Phaistos Disc has inspired not just scholarly papers, but also novels and games, artworks and musical compositions, countless hours of amateur speculation and professional research. It has become a cultural icon, recognized far beyond academic circles. Its image appears on Greek stamps and coins, on tourist souvenirs, in popular books about ancient mysteries. It has become a symbol of the mysterious, the unknown, the tantalizing puzzle that remains just out of reach. This popularization of the disc has been both blessing and curse for serious scholarship. On one hand, it has kept the disc in public consciousness, ensuring continued interest and funding for research. People who might never visit an archaeological museum make an exception to see the Phaistos Disc. Students are drawn to study Bronze Age archaeology partly because of its mysteries like the disc. Public fascination translates into support for research, for excavations, for preservation efforts. On the other hand, this popularity has attracted numerous fringe theories and pseudoscientific interpretations that muddy the waters and make serious academic discussion more difficult. The disc has been claimed as evidence for Atlantis, for ancient astronauts, for lost super-civilizations, for all manner of ideas that have little basis in archaeological evidence. These interpretations generally tell us more about contemporary beliefs and desires than about the actual disc. Some people see in the disc what they want to see, finding patterns that confirm their existing beliefs, reading into the symbols meanings that fit their preferred narratives. This is a natural human tendency, this pattern-seeking, this desire to find significance and connection. But it can lead us astray when we're not careful, when we let wishful thinking override evidence, when we mistake coincidence for causation or similarity for connection. Serious scholars continue to work on the disc, undeterred by the popular speculation and the accumulation of failed decipherment attempts. They approach it with the careful methods of archaeology and linguistics, comparing it systematically with other ancient scripts, analyzing its statistical properties with rigorous mathematical tools, considering its archaeological context with attention to detail. They publish their findings in peer-reviewed journals, subject their theories to scrutiny from other experts, build slowly and carefully on accumulated knowledge. Progress is slow, and certainty remains elusive. But this is the nature of scholarly work with ancient materials. Unlike in detective stories, there is often no moment of sudden revelation, no single clue that unlocks everything. Instead, there is patient accumulation of small insights, gradual refinement of understanding, honest acknowledgement of what we don't know, alongside careful documentation of what we do. One avenue of recent research has focused on the technology of the disc itself, the stamped impressions rather than their meaning. By studying the stamp's characteristics under magnification and various lighting conditions, researchers have tried to determine how they were made and used. This has revealed some interesting technical details that tell us about the manufacturing process, even if they don't tell us what the text means. The stamps appear to have been punched into the clay at a slight angle, which makes sense ergonomically for someone working on a horizontal surface, sitting or kneeling beside the disc as they pressed each symbol. Some symbols show slight variations in their impressions, with depths and angles that vary subtly from one occurrence to another. This could suggest either that the stamps wore over time, becoming less sharp with use, or that multiple stamps existed for common symbols, each with slight individual characteristics. The order in which symbols were impressed can sometimes be determined by examining overlaps and displacement of clay. This technical analysis confirms that work proceeded from the outside edge toward the center, following the spiral path, which tells us about the intended reading direction. Small scratched lines visible under magnification suggest that guidelines were drawn first, creating boxes or spaces that were then filled with stamped symbols, showing careful planning and layout before the actual stamping began. This technical analysis can't tell us what the disc says, but it can tell us about the people who made it and the context in which it was created. It reveals a society with specialized craftsmanship, with tools made specifically for creating texts, with techniques for impression and firing that were sophisticated and controlled. It shows us people who valued permanent records, who had reasons to create texts that would last, who invested time and effort in the act of writing or recording, or whatever this stamping represented to them. The palace where the disc was found, Phaistos, continued to be excavated long after Pernier's initial work in 1908. Italian archaeologists returned in subsequent seasons, and later Greek archaeologists took over the site. These excavations revealed much about Minoan life, about the palace's architecture and administration, about trade networks and religious practices, about daily activities and special ceremonies. Storage rooms yielded information about diet and agriculture. Workshops showed evidence of craft production. Living quarters revealed domestic arrangements. But no other examples of the disc's script were found. Whatever writing system it represents, it appears to have been used rarely, if at all, in the palace's regular administration, which relied on Linear A for its record-keeping. This absence of other examples has been one of the most frustrating aspects of the disc's study. Every new excavation season brings hope that another example might be found, that the disc might finally have a companion text that would provide comparative material. But season after season, that hope remains unfulfilled. This suggests several possibilities about the disc's nature and purpose. Perhaps the disc records something so unique, so specific to a particular occasion or circumstance, that it required its own special script rather than the usual Linear A. Perhaps it was a gift from another culture, already ancient or foreign when it arrived at Phaistos, valued for its exotic origin rather than for any readable content. Perhaps it was a ceremonial object, used in rituals we can no longer reconstruct, with meanings that were understood only by initiates or specialists. Perhaps it was a teaching tool, showing students what writing from distant lands looked like. A kind of ancient example of foreign scripts for educational purposes. Perhaps it was a puzzle or game, deliberately obscure, created for entertainment or intellectual challenge rather than practical communication. Perhaps it was a work of art, valued for its aesthetic qualities and the skill of its manufacture, rather than for any message it contained. Each possibility opens new questions, new avenues for speculation, new ways of thinking about what this object might have meant to the people who made and used it. The Minoans themselves remain somewhat mysterious, despite decades of archaeological investigation. We know they built magnificent palaces with sophisticated architecture and engineering. We know they conducted extensive trade, with Minoan pottery and other goods found throughout the Mediterranean, and evidence of imported materials at Minoan sites. We know they created beautiful art, particularly frescoes showing ceremonial scenes, natural subjects, and daily life. We know they developed at least 2, possibly 3 writing systems, the hieroglyphic script Linear A and Linear B, which was used by their Mycenaean successors. We know they worshipped goddesses and bulls, held ceremonies in mountain peak sanctuaries and sacred caves, performed rituals in elaborate shrine rooms within the palaces. We know they played sophisticated games, engaged in bull-leaping sports that were dangerous and spectacular, valued luxury goods like gold jewelry and carved gemstones. We know their society was complex and organized, capable of large-scale public works and centralized administration, but we don't know what they called themselves. Minoan is a modern term, applied by archaeologist Arthur Evans after the legendary King Minos of Greek mythology. We don't know their political organization with certainty, whether the palaces were independent city-states or parts of a unified kingdom, whether power was centralized or distributed. We don't fully understand their religion beyond its material manifestations. What myths they told, what beliefs they held about creation and death and the nature of divinity, and most frustratingly for scholars of writing and language, we cannot read most of their texts. Linear A remains undeciphered, despite decades of effort. We can identify numbers and some commodity terms through comparison with Linear B, but the language itself resists understanding. And the Phaistos Disc, whatever it is, remains silent in its own unique way, a mystery within the larger mystery of Minoan civilization. There is a particular poignancy to this gap in our knowledge. The Minoans were, by all evidence, a sophisticated and successful civilization. They lasted for over 1,000 years, adapted to challenges including devastating earthquakes and the volcanic eruption of Thera, created works of enduring beauty and impressive engineering. They were real people with real lives, people who loved and feared, who celebrated and mourned, who built and created and left their mark on history and landscape. Yet so much about them is silent now, lost to the passage of time and the fragility of materials and the accidents of preservation. Their voices, speaking languages we cannot understand, echo faintly through artifacts and ruins, but never quite reach us with clarity. We see the shadows they cast but cannot see them fully, cannot hear their thoughts or understand their experiences, except through the imperfect medium of material remains. The Phaistos Disc embodies this silence perfectly. It is a voice we cannot hear, a message we cannot read, a connection we cannot quite make. Yet it persists, this small clay disc, sitting in its museum case, spiral of symbols still clear after 4,000 years. It has outlasted the palace where it was found, outlasted the civilization that created it or imported it or valued it, outlasted countless human lives and endeavors and empires. It has become, in its own way, immortal, if not in meaning, then in physical persistence. As we near the end of our journey through this ancient enigma, it's worth reflecting on what unsolved mysteries offer us beyond frustration and curiosity. In our modern world, we expect answers to our questions. We have search engines that can find information in seconds, experts accessible through various media, databases and reference materials covering almost every conceivable topic. Most questions can be answered with relatively little effort. The idea that something could remain fundamentally unknowable, despite our best efforts and our best tools, is almost foreign to contemporary experience. Yet here is the Phaistos Disc, refusing to yield its secrets despite over a century of study by some of the smartest people in relevant fields. Despite the application of every relevant technology and methodology, from traditional philology to cutting-edge computational analysis, despite genuine desire and effort to understand, the mystery persists not because we haven't tried hard enough, but because the information needed to solve it may simply not exist anymore. Lost when the people who could read it died, lost when the cultural context that made it meaningful disappeared. The key to reading the disc might have been common knowledge in its time, passed orally from teacher to student, understood by anyone literate in the script, as obvious to them as reading English is to us. But if that knowledge was never written down in a form that survived, if it depended on living memory and died with the last person who possessed it, then it's gone, irrevocably. We can't recover what no longer exists, can't reconstruct what left no trace. There is something strangely comforting about this, a reminder that the world is larger and more complex than our ability to fully comprehend it. Not everything can be known. Not every question has an answer waiting to be discovered. Some mysteries will outlast us, passing to future generations who will bring their own tools and methods and perspectives to bear, and who may or may not succeed where we have failed. The universe is under no obligation to be comprehensible to us, and history is under no obligation to preserve all the information we might wish to recover. The Phaistos Disc is also a reminder of the fragility of knowledge and the ease with which meaning can be lost. In its time, the disc's message was clear to someone, probably to multiple people. Someone could pick it up and read it, understand it, use it for whatever purpose it served, find meaning in its spiral of symbols. That knowledge existed, was real, was part of the lived experience of ancient people. Now it's gone. Utterly, and perhaps permanently. Unless by some extraordinary chance another example is found with some key to decipherment, some bilingual text, or clear cultural context that allows us to crack the code. What does this say about our own time and our own knowledge? What information that seems permanent and accessible to us will be incomprehensible to people 4,000 years from now, if our civilization lasts that long, or if anything of it survives? Our digital records might be more vulnerable than we think, dependent on technologies that may not survive, on storage media that degrade or become obsolete, on file formats that future people cannot read, on languages that may evolve beyond recognition or die out entirely. Even our physical books and documents, seeming so permanent, will decay without careful preservation. The Phaistos Disc survived because it was fired clay, an accidentally durable material, buried in conditions that preserved it. How much of what we create today will last 4,000 years? How much will be lost not just to physical decay but to loss of context, to forgetting of cultural meanings, to evolution of language and symbols? The disc reminds us that permanence is relative, that today's clarity can become tomorrow's mystery, that speaking doesn't guarantee being heard across the gulf of time. Yet there is also beauty in mystery, value in questions that remain unanswered. The Phaistos Disc has inspired countless people over the past century, sparked imaginations, driven research, encouraged learning, and curiosity. It has drawn people to museums who might not otherwise visit, introduced them to Bronze Age archaeology and ancient Mediterranean civilizations. It has made people think about writing and language and communication, about how meanings are encoded and decoded, about the challenges of understanding across cultural and temporal distances. Students have chosen careers in archaeology or linguistics partly because of mysteries like the Phaistos Disc. Researchers have developed new analytical methods in attempts to decipher it. The disc has generated thousands of pages of scholarly writing, hundreds of attempted decipherments, countless hours of thought and effort. It has been productive in its mystery, generative rather than merely frustrating. And it has reminded us that history is not a closed book, that discoveries and questions remain, that the past still has surprises for us. In a way, the disc's mystery enhances rather than diminishes its significance. If we could read it easily, and it turned out to be an inventory of olive oil and grain, a routine administrative document like so many linear B tablets, would we still find it so captivating? Would it draw the crowds it does? inspire the interest it generates. Perhaps it's precisely the unknowability that makes it special, that gives it power to engage our imagination and sustain our attention across generations of study. It is a canvas for wonder, an invitation to think about ancient lives and lost knowledge, a reminder of human ingenuity and creativity, a testament to the passage of time and the persistence of material objects when knowledge fades. It asks us to imagine who made it and why, what it meant to them, what purposes it served. It invites speculation while refusing confirmation, offers clues while withholding solutions. It is, in its own way, perfect in its imperfection, complete in its incompleteness. Let your breathing slow and deepen now, matching the patient rhythm of archaeological time, where objects wait centuries in darkness before returning to light, where discoveries happen slowly and understanding builds gradually. You need not solve any mysteries tonight. You need not decipher any ancient scripts or unlock any secrets. Simply rest, knowing that some things are meant to remain mysterious, that some questions are more valuable for asking than for answering, that wonder itself is a gift we can receive without needing to resolve it into certainty. The Phaistos Disc continues its journey through time, from its creation 4,000 years ago, by unknown hands for unknown purposes, through its burial beneath the destroyed palace, to its discovery on that summer day in 1908, to its current home in the museum case where thousands view it annually, to this moment now as these words describe it to you, to whatever future awaits it in museums yet unbuilt and times yet to come. It is still here, still whole, still mysterious, still offering its silent spiral of symbols to anyone willing to look, to wonder, to contemplate the vast spaces between what we know and what we can never know. Think of how many eyes have gazed upon this disc over the past century and more. Scholars and students, tourists and enthusiasts, children and elders, people from every continent and culture and background. Each person brings their own perspective, their own questions, their own sense of wonder and curiosity. Some see in it a linguistic puzzle to be solved. Others see an aesthetic object of beauty and craft. Still others see a connection to ancient worlds, a tangible link to people long dead, and the disc receives all these gazes equally, giving nothing away to any of them, keeping its secrets with democratic inscrutability. The symbols spiral inward toward the center, each one clear and distinct, despite 4 millennia of existence. Each one pressed carefully into the clay by hands that have been dust for thousands of years. The running man, still captured in mid-stride. The plumed head, still wearing its distinctive headdress. The ship, still sailing on clay seas toward clay shores. The shield, still held by no warrior. The flower, still blooming in fired permanence. The bee or wasp, still flying through ceramic space. All the various signs that make up this mysterious text, frozen in the moment of their creation, unchanged while empires rose and fell around them. They look out at us, across the gulf of time, representing something, meaning something, encoding information, or prayer, or story, or game, or something else entirely. But what? We may never know, and perhaps that's all right. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to persist, meant to remind us of the limits of our knowledge and the vastness of what we don't understand. Perhaps the Phaistos Disc serves its purpose better as mystery than it ever could as deciphered text. Consider what it meant to be the person who made this disc. They knew exactly what it said, what every symbol meant, why they were creating this object, what purpose it would serve. To them, it was not mysterious at all. It was as clear as any written text is to someone who knows the language and script. They would be amazed, perhaps bemused, certainly surprised to know that 4,000 years later, people would still be looking at their handiwork, still puzzling over it, still seeking to understand what to them was perfectly clear. They could not have imagined the museum case, the scholarly papers, the countless theories, the enduring fascination, the books written about their disc, the people like you listening to its story as they prepare for sleep. They made it for some immediate purpose, some need of their own time, and could not have conceived that it would outlast everything else they knew, that it would become one of the most famous artifacts of their entire civilization, famous precisely because we cannot understand it. Sleep well, dear listener, and dream of symbols spiraling inward, of hands pressing stamps into soft clay, of messages preserved but not understood, of the deep patience of objects that outlast empires and civilizations and the very languages in which they were created. Dream of museum cases and ancient palaces, of discoveries and mysteries, of all the things we know and all the vastly more numerous things we don't. The Silent Archives thanks you for joining us tonight in contemplating this ancient mystery. This small clay disc that holds so much wonder in its 16 centimeters of fired earth, so much frustration in its refusal to be read, so much reminder of how much we don't know about the past, and perhaps never will. It has been a companion on your journey toward sleep, a gentle puzzle to occupy the mind as consciousness softens and dims, until we meet again in that quiet space between waking and sleeping, between understanding and mystery, between the known past and the unknowable. Rest peacefully. The disc remains, as it has remained, as it will continue to remain. The symbols spiral inward, eternal in their silence, perfect in their incomprehensibility, beautiful in their enduring mystery. The Phaistos Disc sits in its case, waiting for someone to finally understand it, perhaps. Or perhaps simply waiting, content in its own existence, its own persistence through time, its own refusal to yield all secrets. It has already won its battle against oblivion. It has survived when so much else has been lost. Whether we can read it or not, it endures. And in enduring, it reminds us that some things last precisely because they refuse to fully reveal themselves, because they maintain their mystery, because they invite us to wonder rather than demanding that we know. The spiral continues, always beginning again at the outer edge, always leading inward toward a center we can approach but never quite reach, always offering the possibility of meaning while withholding certainty. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the journey inward is its own destination, the wondering, its own reward, the mystery, its own meaning. Tamam shud, as we said before in another story, it is ended, or perhaps, in the way of all good mysteries, it spirals on forever. An eternal question mark pressed into Mediterranean clay, a permanent invitation to wonder what cannot be known, a lasting reminder that the past speaks to us in languages we may never fully understand.